So in the last lecture, we talked about osmoregulation, some of the basics of osmoregulation, including osmosis and osmolarity, why osmoregulation is important, and different osmoregulation patterns in different types of organisms. Now we're going to look at how osmoregulation and excretion are related to one another. Excretion is essentially the same as getting rid of nitrogenous wastes. Why do we have nitrogenous wastes to get rid of? Well, as a result of all of our metabolic processes, especially cellular respiration, we end up having waste products because of that. So when we consume food, we end up having to break some of that down to use for energy. When we break food down, we end up having proteins and nucleic acids, and those get broken down more and more and more. And as a byproduct, we have something that's very similar to ammonia. This is called an amino group, and the formation of amino groups from larger molecules is called deamination. Okay, so this is deamination is essentially the result of breaking down of these larger molecules that we require for energy or for building macromolecules for other purposes. So when we break down these foods for energy or for producing other things, we end up getting waste products, these amino groups, which easily form ammonia. Ammonia is toxic, and you can see the reason why they're called nitrogenous wastes is because they all have this nitrogen in them. So ammonia is the easiest waste product to basically produce from the amino groups, but it is toxic. And so we need to find a way of getting rid of these nitrogenous wastes in our body so that they don't become at a level that's toxic to us. Nitrogenous wastes have to be dissolved into water in order to be excreted. And the more toxic the nitrogenous waste, the more water is required for excretion. Different forms of waste require more or less water. So ammonia is going to be the most toxic and requiring the most amount of water. Urea is the second most toxic. It requires a little bit of energy to create urea from ammonia, but it's a little bit less toxic. And uric acid is the least toxic, but it's the most complex of these different forms of nitrogenous waste. Requires a lot of energy to get into this form, but it's pretty much non-toxic and doesn't require a lot of water for excretion. So we're going to talk about different strategies of nitrogenous waste removal. The first one is flushing, and flushing is typically used with aquatic organisms. Flushing involves excretion of ammonia. And as I said before, ammonia is very toxic and it requires a lot of water. So flushing of ammonia can occur in organisms that live in an aquatic environment because they have access to a lot of water for excretion. So the ammonia does not have to exist in their blood for very long, and in terms of fish and crawfish, for example, they can just send the ammonia to their gills, and the water that's rushing across their gills can help them excrete the ammonia through the gills. So that's flushing. Detoxification is when the ammonia is converted to urea, which is, as I said before, a less toxic form of nitrogenous waste, and then it can be transported to the kidneys for excretion there. So you can either flush the ammonia or you can detoxify it by putting it into a new form of urea, and as I said before, that takes some energy to do. A third strategy is called insolubilization. And in this case, the ammonia is converted into a more solid form. So it's converted to uric or guanic acid, and this is common in birds and in bats. And it requires a lot of energy, as I showed you in that last figure, but because it's more complex. But it can be excreted as a solid. It requires a lot less water for excretion, and so this is really important for animals who need to conserve water because they don't have to release a bunch of water with their nitrogenous waste. So there are several excretory processes that we need to talk about. Most of them produce urine by refining a filtrate that's derived from body fluids. So basically what that means is you're using your body fluids, or some could be interstitial fluid or hemolymph if you are an insect, or it could be blood, but you are filtering that and taking out the wastes and other solutes. So most excretory systems do that. They produce urine by refining the filtrate. And we're going to talk about how that works in this section and the next section as well. So these are the key functions of most excretory systems. Filtration, which is the filtering of body fluids. Once you filter the body fluids, a lot of extra stuff comes out that you need to reclaim. So reabsorption typically happens where the body reclaims some of the water and the solutes that it has filtered out. And secretion is another stage where non-essential solutes that were not filtered out get added to the filtrate that's going to be excreted. So you have filtration occurring where a bunch of stuff is leaving, for example, the circulatory system, and then you have to reclaim some of that stuff that you want to keep. And finally, sometimes you need to add additional materials to the stuff you need to get rid of. So that's secretion. And finally, once this filtrate is fully processed, then the body can excrete it, which means releasing the filtrate from the body. So this is a very, very basic figure to just show you how some of those things happen. In this case, the body fluid that's being filtered is blood, and it's coming in from a capillary over here. The capillary is coming into whatever the excretory organ is here. And so in this place right here, this is where filtration is happening. So all of this fluid is basically, a lot of the fluid is being pushed out of the capillaries and entering this tubule right here. Red blood cells and stuff like that, the big stuff is going to stay inside the capillaries, but a lot of stuff, including water and solutes and nitrogenous waste, is going to get pushed out. Then the capillary is going to travel along and be closely associated with this excretory tubule. And while it is closely associated with the excretory tubule, it reclaims some of the water and solutes that actually need to be kept in the body. Okay, so a lot of stuff gets pushed out. Some of it gets reclaimed, and then at another part of the tube, at another part of the capillary, additional materials that the body does not need get secreted back into this excretory tubule, and eventually that urine will be excreted. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of excretory organs in different species. The first one we're going to talk about is Protonephridia. These are found in several different types of animals, but I think we've seen flatworms before. I think we used a flatworm image for the gastrovascular cavity, so we're going to use that organism again. These are, there are several different species of them, but in this case we're going to be looking at a freshwater flatworm. And the reason I need to tell you that is because it has to do with how excretion and osmoregulation can be both involved in terms of the excretory organs. So the name of this, again, is Protonephridia. That's the name of the excretory organ, and this is a flatworm that has the Protonephridia. And you can see there's all these series of small little tubes within the flatworm. If you were to look at the end of one of these tubes, there's these things called flame bulbs. They are consisting of two different cells. You have a tubule cell, so this is the excretory tubule, and a cap cell. So these are really just hanging out within the interstitial fluid. And here you can see that on the cap cell, the inside of the cap cell, there are cilia. The cilia beat, and as they beat, it brings interstitial fluid into the cap cell, and then that material, that fluid, is pushed out through the opening of the body wall. So some solutes are coming in here and being pushed out, but mostly this is just a whole lot of water, and whatever happens to be in the water gets pushed out of the body wall. So remember, this is a freshwater flatworm, and so osmoregulation is really important here. Water wants to move into the flatworm because the water is hypoosmotic to the flatworm. And so this Protonephridia is not only a way of getting rid of nitrogenous wastes, which move out with the water, but it's very dilute, and it's also just moving a lot of water out of its body. So the Protonephridia is an excretory organ, but it's also osmoregulatory. It's really important for osmoregulation. Second type of excretory organ is Metanephridia, and these are found in earthworms. So here you can see a picture of an earthworm, and you know how these earthworms have all these different segments? So each segment of an earthworm actually has two Metanephridia, but it's just showing one here. So basically what's happening is the body fluids are entering the collecting tubule right here through this internal opening. Okay, there's cilia again that are near the opening here, and as they move, water is drawn into this internal opening, which connects to the collecting tubule over here. I'm going to follow the collecting tubule around so you can see that it goes up and around. And eventually it's going to come over here into what's called the bladder. The bladder is, just as it is for us, it's a place where the filtrate is collected right before excretion. So what happens in this case is the material, the body fluid comes in here, and this capillary system that's surrounding this collecting tubule is responsible for reclaiming some of the solutes that have been captured in this collecting tubule. So the capillary network is picking up water and solutes that it needs, that the body still needs, and then whatever is left gets stored in the bladder and then released to the outside. So you can see that each one of these different segments of the earthworm has its own bladder, actually two, and own external openings where it releases its nitrogenous waste. The earthworm also uses the collecting tubule for osmoregulation as well. Again, some of that has to do with how much water is reclaimed within this capillary network and how much water ends up being released out of this external opening. And that's going to depend on if the earthworm is in a situation where it's very, very wet and water happens to be moving into the body, or if it happens to be in a drier environment where water is getting pulled away from it. That's going to change how much water is reabsorbed in that capillary network. The last type of excretory organ that we're going to talk about besides the kidney is called Malpighian tubules. These are found in insects like this grasshopper. And what Malpighian tubules do is they are actually like closely associated with the digestive tract of a grasshopper or of an insect. And so the nitrogenous waste for these is actually going to be released with the feces. So all that's going to be joined together, which is different from a lot of the other systems that you'll become familiar with. So the Malpighian tubules are these little extensions that are sort of just free-floating in the hemolymph, because remember, insects have hemolymph rather than blood, and they have an open circulatory system. So from the hemolymph, salt and water and nitrogenous wastes are basically enter these Malpighian tubules. The insect actually pumps nitrogenous wastes and salts, the waste products, into the Malpighian tubules, and water ends up following through osmosis. which is not great because the insects really need to conserve water, but water is going to follow those nitrogenous wastes because it's going to go down the water potential. So everything from the Malpighian tubules gets channeled into the digestive tract. So you've got all of these wastes in here, but a lot of extra water. And as it moves through the digestive tract, gets to the rectum area, the combination of feces and urine, and in this area, the body reabsorbs all the stuff that it needs that it didn't want to get rid of, like water, ions, and other valuable organic materials. So right in the rectum, all of these things become reclaimed, and then the feces and urine that are released are almost dry. In general, insects really need to conserve water, so this is a pretty efficient way of doing that. And again, this excretory organ, Malpighian tubules, are also really important in terms of osmoregulation, as I just noted. Okay, finally, I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to the kidney, which is an excretory organ in vertebrates. This is the position of the kidney. They're actually towards your back, but as you can see, they have arteries and veins leading to them and coming from them. And here you can see the ureters that are joining the kidneys to the urinary bladder. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but if we were to look at the kidney and take a cross-section of it, these are some different structures that you need to know something about because it's going to influence how the kidney functions. This top or this outer layer is called the renal cortex, and interior to that is the renal medulla. And this whole area, each one of these little things, little triangles, is called the renal pyramid. Down here, collecting ducts, which we'll talk about later, are all going to lead here to the renal pelvis, and a bunch of filtrate is going to be collecting in the renal pelvis, and then it will end up entering the ureter, which will take it down to the bladder. Okay, so here we have the renal pelvis. Right, the blood that comes in that is going to be actually filtered by the kidney comes in through the renal artery, and the renal artery is going to break up into arterioles and capillaries, and that's where all the blood filtration is going to happen. So the blood's basically going to lose a large portion of its water and solutes into the kidney, and then as it gets processed, the blood is going to reclaim all of the material that it needs, including water and important solutes, and it's going to leave in the kidney the waste products. And then this renal vein will bring the blood that now it doesn't have the waste products in it. It does have carbon dioxide, but it doesn't have nitrogenous waste. It's going to bring that back to the heart. And if we were to look at this up close, you can see that a renal pyramid has a series of tubules in it, and each of these little tubules is called a nephron. We're going to talk about exactly how nephrons function in the next lecture. But the kidney is extremely efficient. It has a big job to do. The kidney extracts about 45 gallons of fluid from about 2,000 liters of blood that passes through the kidney every single day. So basically, 45 gallons of fluid get dumped into the kidney, and then from that 45 gallons, so much of that water gets reclaimed and solutes that ultimately that 45 gallons creates about 1.5 liters of urine. So it has to be a very efficient structure, and we're going to talk about how that works in the next one.